It's 7 o'clock. I'm Dermot Manahan, and this is a Sky News special as the war in Ukraine enters its second month. NATO, EU and G7 leaders hold 3 emergency summits in Brussels. Leaders approved major increases to forces in Eastern Europe and pledged to equip Ukraine to fight against Russian chemical and nuclear warfare.
NATO has never been more united than it is today. Putin is getting exactly the opposite what he intended to have as a consequence of going into Ukraine.
The heroism of Ukraine has changed the geopolitics of Europe. Vladimir Putin has badly miscalculated, and I believe he knows it.
Meanwhile, Ukraine's Navy claims to have destroyed a Russian landing ship. After weeks of being cut off from all help, the besieged people of Mariupol queue for humanitarian aid. And a warm welcome from the British families giving refugees a way out from the war. Good evening. Well, now, it's been described as one of the most important meetings in the history of the alliance. NATO leaders met in Brussels today to discuss how to help Ukraine continue to defend itself against Russia. The alliance announced it will send 40,000 more troops to its eastern flank, 4 battle groups to Slovakia, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria. The G7 and the EU have also been meeting, extraordinary summits taking place in extraordinary times, as concern grows about whether Russia might resort to using chemical weapons next in Ukraine. And in Brussels, President Biden said NATO allies had never been more united.
NATO has never been more united than it is today. Putin is getting exactly the opposite what he intended to have as a consequence of going into Ukraine. And today, I'm announcing the United States is prepared to commit more than $1 billion in humanitarian assistance to help get relief to millions of Ukrainians affected by the war in Ukraine. Many Ukrainian refugees will wish to stay in Europe, closer to their homes. But we've also will welcome 100,000 Ukrainians to the United States with a focus on reuniting families. And we will invest $320 million to bolster democratic resilience and defend human rights in Ukraine and neighboring countries. We're also coordinating with the G7 and the European Union on food security as well as energy security.
And the Prime Minister also pledged more lethal aid would be sent to Ukraine, including 6,000 more missiles and £25 million in funding for Ukraine's armed forces.
Today, I've announced that we in the UK will send an additional 6,000 missiles and provide £25 million in unrestricted funding for Ukraine's armed forces, more than doubling the lethal aid we've provided to date. We're bolstering our support for the NATO countries on the front line, sending a new deployment of UK troops to Bulgaria on top of doubling our troops both in Poland and in Estonia. The message that President Putin can take from today's extraordinary meeting of NATO and the G7 is this: Ukraine is not alone. We stand with the people of Kiev, of Mariupol, of Lviv and Donetsk. And as President Zelensky has said himself, the people of Ukraine will prevail, and Putin must fail, and he will fail.
Well, NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said the military alliance is stepping up its defences in the event of a chemical or nuclear attack by Russia.
Our top military commander, General Walters, has activated NATO's chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear defense elements, and allies are deploying additional chemical and biological and nuclear defenses to reinforce our existing and new battle groups.
And in a pre-recorded video message, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was clear about what support he wants from NATO.
On the 24th of February, I addressed you with a personal request. Please help us shelter our skies in any format, protect our people from Russian bombs and missiles. We didn't get a clear answer. Ukraine doesn't have powerful anti-missile defense, and Russia has superiority in the skies, and they have weapons of mass destruction.
Now is Sky's Defence and Security Editor, Deborah Haynes, who's in Brussels. So let's discuss NATO, first of all, Deborah, and maintaining its unity and bolstering its eastern flank.
Yes, so like you said, there's two elements really to this summit. There was what the NATO allies can do for Ukraine and also what they can do for themselves in terms of resetting their entire defence and deterrence posture. They realise that the moves that they made in the wake of Russia's first invasion of Ukraine back in 2014 just clearly haven't been enough. It hasn't stopped Russia from launching that extraordinary intervention in Ukraine. And so what you're really sensing here at NATO headquarters is this galvanised sense of requirement to invest in their defences, mobilise troops, increase the readiness of troops, warships, warplanes in a way that we just haven't seen since the end of the Cold War. There used to be this restricting factor, which was an agreement between NATO and Russia that would see that NATO wouldn't be deploying troops on a permanent basis in its east, anywhere near the sort of where the former Soviet sphere of influence would have been. But it seems that that isn't being adhered to as much or given as much weight, given the fact that Russia has effectively ripped up the rule books with what it's done in Ukraine. And then as well as that, you've also got the requirement from NATO allies to help President Zelensky. We were told that in the address that he gave, because he spoke as well to the NATO leaders here during their morning summit, he didn't actually use the term no-fly zone. He didn't specifically ask for that. He knows that he's not going to get that from NATO. They've warned repeatedly that if they were to impose a no-fly zone, that would require NATO jets shooting Russian planes out the sky, destroying Russian air defence systems, which would mean a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia, and that could lead to World War III, something that everyone here seems very determined to avoid. Instead, the Ukrainian president asked NATO to gift him 1% of all of their jets, all of their tanks, in order to help his military defend their territory. And it's interesting that from the allies, you didn't get a clear response to that. There's a balancing act going on right now between making sure they're increasing the lethality of the weapons and assistance that they're giving the Ukrainian armed forces in order for the Ukrainian military to be able to contend with increased lethality on the Russian side, but at the same time not giving too much, that they overstep an invisible threshold, frankly, that would then mean that Russia might view the NATO assistance as direct intervention and would again lead to the same kind of direct confrontation between NATO and Russia.
And let's talk more about any potential confrontation between NATO and Russia. And could that be sparked then by the potential use of chemical or biological or even nuclear weapons?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's interesting, isn't it, that we haven't had a specific red line given by NATO today. The Secretary General was asked about this specifically in terms of what would NATO do to respond if Russia did decide to use, for example, chemical weapons. It's something that the allies are really worried about. They know that Russia has the potential to do that kind of atrocity, which is illegal under international law. And yet they know too that were they to set a red line, say, for example, to specifically spell out that were Russia to use chemical weapons, for example, that would trigger a military response by NATO in Ukraine, then again you are on that slide path to a full-scale war in Europe, and they don't want to set those parameters. I thought Joe Biden, the US president's response again to that exact same question was really interesting. Nobody wants to be pinned down. They want to keep Putin guessing. And he said that the US would of course respond should Russia use chemical weapons. But he said that the nature of the response would depend upon the nature of the use. So clearly there is a sliding scale here in terms of the amount of weapons used and the response that would then trigger.
OK, Deborah Haynes in Brussels, thank you. Well, now let's get the latest analysis of the situation on the ground in Ukraine. Sky's Wilfred Frost has the latest.
Let's get the latest analysis of the situation on the ground in Ukraine. General Sir Richard Barrons is with me. General Sir Richard, a very good afternoon to you. Before we dive into Ukraine itself, given that NATO leaders, of course, meeting during the course of today, we thought we'd have a snapshot here of, in blue, Europe's NATO members. And General Sir Richard, what do you think was likely the main point they were discussing behind closed doors?
So there are two very important aspects. The first is NATO is now resetting how it does deterrence and defence for the length and breadth of NATO, with a very difficult relationship with Russia under President Putin in mind. So this is about spending pledges and increasing the readiness of forces. And the second thing, rather more in the here and now, is what do they do to support the Ukrainian military, not just through sanctions, but with money and the continuing the supply of weapons.
Let's dive in a little bit, particularly to the eastern flank of NATO and some of those specific announcements that we did hear, announced last night and then confirmed today.
So we saw announcements today that they were going to add 4 more battle groups to the battle groups that NATO has on its eastern flank, into Slovakia, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria. Those battle groups will be about 1,500 to 2,000 soldiers each from a number of nations, and are designed to send a signal of assurance to those countries and of deterrence to Russia.
Diving in now to the situation on the ground in Ukraine and Kiev in particular, there's been some talk of some successful counterattacks from Ukrainian forces. How significant are those?
So they are quite significant in that it shows that the Russian advance around Kiev appears to be continuing to struggle. So we've seen counterattacks around Irpin and Bucha. In those cases, quite small numbers of Russian forces appear to have been encircled and possibly taken prisoner. But what's more relevant here is we're continuing to see Russia struggling to deal with Kiev as an objective, and it's one indication of how the Russian campaign overall appears to be, in its current format, stalling.
Well, let's touch on that, because if we zoom out now and look at Ukraine as a whole, we get a snapshot of how the advance has stalled, because as we stand here on the fourth week, at the end of the fourth week of this war, the shaded areas in red haven't changed too much this final fourth week.
You're absolutely right. So we've talked about Kiev, and they aren't any closer to getting into Kiev. They are able to shell it. In the south, the advance is out of the Crimea, still struggling to capture Mariupol, although that is being battered to pieces, and one imagines they will eventually come to some sort of conclusion there. The advance we've been talking about on Odessa now for a couple of weeks hasn't yet really materialised in any sense. We do think that it's still an objective, and we might see that more movement on the land and from the sea in due course. And in the centre around the Donbass, it looks like the Russians, when they can, would try to encircle the effective Ukrainian forces that are there. But what we're beginning to see is Russia not being able to take much more territory, of having to think about doing one thing at once well, rather than several things at once. And the Ukrainians being successful in holding the Russian advances back, but not able to push them out of Ukraine. This begins to feel like a stalemate that could last for weeks or months or even longer.
General Sir Richard Barrons, thanks so much. That's the latest 1 month into this war.
Well, a short time ago, Sky's Sally Lockwood gave us this update from Lviv in western Ukraine.
In the last month of war, more than a quarter of Ukraine's population are now homeless, and we're meeting people here every day in Lviv, in the west of Ukraine, who have fled fighting in search of safety. And they're here, you know, with their families, whatever they can carry, with their children, trying to plan what happens next. And many of them have escaped areas where they've been subjected to an awful lot. People have arrived here absolutely exhausted, some without phone signal. Many haven't had internet connection. So in terms of being able to stay across what's happening in Brussels, that is really quite a luxury, but certainly any extra help from the West would very much be welcomed here in Ukraine. There is a real sense of trauma here, but of course resilience as well. Now you just need to look at that southern city of Mariupol that has been absolutely devastated in recent weeks to see the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding in this country in certain areas. Those bombings of Mariupol already labelled war crimes, and certainly we've just met 3 female generations of one family who've managed to escape Mariupol. It took them 4 days. The grandmother saying that she wouldn't wish their ordeal even on their Russian enemies. And we met another mother with 3 children who's arrived here as well, now looking as to what she does next. And she did actually say that she would like to see the skies closed over Ukraine, and that is, of course, how it's become known here. President Zelensky's calling on NATO to impose a no-fly zone over the country, because while the ground offensives by Russian forces have stalled, have been fairly disastrous compared to what many suspected at the beginning, thinking that Kyiv would fall within a matter of days, the government would be toppled very quickly. Well, none of that has happened. Ukrainian forces have fought back fearlessly and done extremely well. They've even retaken ground in certain areas, but they are running out of ammunition. They're running out of equipment. And as we heard there, in Brussels, President Zelensky is calling for more military support here in Ukraine. He also mentioned the potential use of phosphorus bombs here in Ukraine by Russia. Now, that's not been verified. We haven't had any confirmation of that, but there are 2 unconfirmed reports of phosphorus bombs being used in the outskirts of the capital Kyiv and also in the Lugansk region. And obviously that is of huge concern, that chemical bombs may be something that we see being used here in Ukraine, and of course would be a red line. It is against the Geneva Convention, and it would be considered a war crime. And of course, there would be huge pressure on NATO in how they would respond to that. But certainly here in the western city of Lviv, where there have been tens of thousands of families fleeing for the last 4 weeks, it does feel quieter today. It does feel calmer. There is a sense of confidence that Ukraine will get through this. The concern is at what cost?
Sally Lockwood in Lviv there. Well, the Ukrainian military says it has destroyed a large Russian troop ship in the southern port city of Berdyansk. Sky News has located and verified this video. The Deputy Defence Minister of Ukraine says the ship can carry up to 20 tanks, 45 armoured personnel carriers and 400 troops. Well, in a month of conflict, the southeastern city of Mariupol has, of course, borne the brunt of some of the worst attacks as Russian forces have bombarded civilian targets, leaving people without basic necessities like drinking water. The Ukrainian government, as well as the EU, the UK and the US, have accused Russia of committing war crimes there. But so far, the city has refused to surrender. For many residents, their only way out has been to take their chances and head to Zaporizhzhia, about 140 miles west. Our correspondent John Sparks has been speaking to some of the thousands of people arriving there and has this story.
This unremarkable spot in a place called Zaporizhzhia means a lot to the people of Mariupol. It's a beacon of light in the dazzling sunshine, and it marks the end of a horrific ordeal.
It's really strong, painful experience. And now we need to start our life from the beginning.
It's just a car park, isn't it? But it's actually more than that.
It's sun, sky, so thanks God.
They arrive in a procession of battered-looking cars with a sign saying children in the windows. The journey from Mariupol is relatively short, but it is a dangerous trip, and some take days to complete it. How do you feel?
По сравнению с Мариуполем, вот так.
Helena and her family have negotiated 15 Russian checkpoints, but she and her granddaughter, Alisa, are safe.
I'm fine.
You're fine. Okay. You've had quite an experience.
Ну, было в Мариуполе очень страшно, потому что мы жили на 8-м этаже, и наш дом шатался туды-сюды. Потом мы пошли к бабушке на 4-й этаж, там уже все устаканилось, не шаталось. И то мы сидим в ванной, а там стены шатаются, даже крем с полки упал.
Irina and her family took 6 days to get here. They ran out of petrol halfway, but she couldn't spend another minute in Mariupol.
I don't know really how to describe it, because you don't know, will you be alive in a minute or no? Will your son will be alive or no? One night he said to me, my son, he is 10 years old. Sorry, just 1 minute. He asked me, Mama, will I see my birthday in August or no? Will I be alive? And I didn't know what to say to him.
On the other side of the street, we found another convoy of cars hoping to make the trip back to Mariupol. The owners want to pick up family or friends or bury those killed in the fighting. Alexander's mother lived in a building that was hit by a shell, and he said he wasn't able to reach her.
Та сама переднего. Два дня подряд.
It's been cold, he said, very cold. I doubt she's alive. If I find a leg, I find a leg, but I will bury her. Some families bring their documents and the clothes on their back. Others, like the Lashenkos, have brought the business. And their business is French bulldogs and pugs. They've got 50 of them, now living in 2 vans.
You don't have much room back there.
Да, у нас вообще места нет. Но мы с собаками на руках едем, на ногах. Все вместе с нами. Маленькие и все с нами.
36,000 people have passed through this car park, along with a large family of French bulldogs. Their lives have been uprooted, their homes have been destroyed, but where there is life, there is hope. John Sparks, Sky News, in Zaporizhia.
Now, just to alert you to our new programme, Beth Rigby Interviews. And tonight, Beth will be sitting down with Anusha Ashuri, who was detained in Iran for 5 years and released last week, along with Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe. Beth's also going to be speaking to the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak. That's Beth Rigby Interviews tonight at 9 on Sky News and tomorrow at 8 a.m. on Sky Showcase. And you're watching Sky News Tonight. Coming up, the first people matched under the Homes for Ukraine are in England. We'll have the latest.
Like pulling us out of that little room.
Mandatory evacuation, you must leave.
I'm Greg Milam, Sky's US correspondent here in Los Angeles. It is almost impossible to predict where these fires will go next. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. This gives you an idea of the strength of those winds, strong enough to bend and twist metal. Are you trying to run me over, Sir Philip?
No, go away.
Look like it, sir. Will you respond to those who made accusations, Sir Philip?
Can you go away?
I've seen the dark side of America. We are standing on the supply line right into the heart of America's opioid crisis. I've seen heartbreaking human stories.
There was a river of blood coming out of the mosque. That's a scene that you don't forget.
Christchurch has been changed forever by what happened here.
I love my job because I get to do something that is contributing to a better future.
Now, the first Ukrainian refugees to be matched with families in England under the government's Homes for Ukraine scheme have arrived. Many have had to leave their families, not sure when they'll see them again. 30-year-old Ilona Lemeka was amongst the first to arrive at Stansted Airport, and she's been speaking to Sky's Becky Cottrell about fleeing her hometown of Dnipro in eastern Ukraine.
After a nervous wait.
Ilona? Hello.
This was the first time Ilona from Ukraine met Sarah from Bedford. They'll now be living together, along with Sarah's husband and children. Ilona is safe with them, but she came here on her own.
And this is my husband.
Saying goodbye to her entire life.
You don't understand where you're going, how long time you will be absent in your family, and how long you won't see them, not only on, I don't know, FaceTime or something like that.
And how was it leaving your husband and your parents?
Ну, родители... Ну, они понимают, для чего это все, потому что, каждый родитель волнуется за своего ребенка.
Ilona is from Dnipro, where many speak Russian, but she knew she had to get out when a missile narrowly missed her house. And what would you say to President Putin?
Прочь с нашей страны, это наша страна, это наша земля. Вас вообще никто не звал. Разбирайтесь со своим, с тем, что у вас и так много проблем.
Sarah will get £350 a month for looking after Ilona, but she'd do it for free. She even paid for her flight to the UK.
Seeing the desperation, all these people in these families, it's so hard for us to comprehend how they would feel. But you can understand when somebody needs help.
Ilona wants to find work as soon as possible, but maybe she needs to acclimatise first.
She came down this morning wearing a coat and we're inside.
Settling in for all of them is going to be awkward and difficult at times. But this family has given Ilona a way out of war, and there are millions more who need that. Becky Cottrell, Sky News, Bedford.
And plenty more on Ukraine. Sure to feature in tomorrow's papers. We'll have our press preview and news review from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be the politics editor of Galdem magazine, Moya Lothian-McLean, and the Director of Communications with the Institute of Economic Affairs, Annabel Denham. And time now for a look at the weather. And the next few days are going to stay settled with plenty of continuing sunshine. Air pollution levels, though, will be pretty high in the east. So most places dry this evening, if a bit cold, but some showers are possible, those mainly in southern and eastern Scotland. Not much change overnight. The far north will have some cloud thickening up, a bit of rain too, a patchy ground frost developing with some mist and fog around as well. So tomorrow morning, almost unbroken sunshine once that mist and fog lifts, but some areas in the north will be dull and damp. And you're watching Sky News tonight. Coming up, as NATO meets to discuss the situation in Ukraine, is another country revisiting its own decision not to join the military alliance. Welcome back. You're watching Sky News Tonight. The top stories this evening, and the American President Joe Biden says that NATO has never been more united as the alliance pledges to send 40,000 more troops to Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria and Romania. The Ukrainian Navy has said it's destroyed a Russian warship in the key southern port of Berdyansk. And the first Ukrainian refugees to be matched with families in England under the government's Homes for Ukraine scheme are spending their first days in England. OK, let's concentrate then on the help for Ukraine that is being discussed by Western leaders in Brussels today. NATO's Secretary-General has announced further support, including equipment to protect against potential nuclear and chemical attacks. Another country that sits on Russia's border but is not a NATO member is Finland. The Nordic country has enjoyed relative peace despite being outside the alliance. However, after the invasion of Ukraine, Finns may be reassessing that position. Let's speak then to Finland's Foreign Minister, Pekka Haavisto. Very good to talk to you, Foreign Minister, and I'm sure you heard my introduction then. So the question is, are Finns revisiting this decision to remain non-aligned?
Well, good evening to you. If you look at opinion polls now, after the Russian attack against Ukraine, there has been a very dramatic change, and majority of the Finnish citizens are now in favor of the NATO membership. And of course, this has triggered then also a process that the government will issue a white paper on different security options to the parliament, and these issues will be discussed.
What's your own view?
As a foreign minister, of course, I'm standing behind the current policy. We have, in our previous white papers, government has adopted this kind of NATO option that things should be reassessed if security situation changes in Europe. And of course, we are in the middle of very dramatic change, and it's at least important to discuss how we can develop our NATO partnership. We have a very close partnership together with Sweden, and this is something that Finland values quite a lot.
Well, given the proximity to Russia and indeed the history with Russia, Finnish people no doubt looking at Ukraine and thinking, well, they would not have been invaded perhaps if they had been admitted into NATO. Is that the main reason behind the change in public opinion?
Well, Finns are very security-oriented people, and when in the autumn there was this migration flow or organized migration from Belarus against Poland and Latvia and Lithuania, the Finnish people were asking, what if this happening on our border? And now when we saw the Russian attack against Ukraine and the attack against the capital Kiev and so forth, Finns are asking the very same question, what if this is happening on our borders? And particularly, people are threatened by the new types of weapons, the possibility of using chemical weapons in this type of warfare, or even using tactical nuclear weapons. We might ask that we have a quite good conventional army against all kinds of conventional threats, but the new threats, including, of course, many hybrid threats, are something where we certainly need support, and we have been looking at it also through European Union's common security paragraph. But of course, NATO is much stronger in Europe on these issues.
But do you share that? I suppose it's quite a simplistic analysis that Ukraine might not have been invaded if it had been admitted into NATO, and indeed further back if it hadn't given up its nuclear weapons.
Well, we can speculate on those issues, but of course that we witness in Europe attack against an independent country of this scale has been shocking for all of us, and this is maybe something that we did not expect, but this is happening, and of course this has to change also our own security assessment.
Just fill us in a little bit. I mean, so many people talking. I mentioned there Finland's history with Russia, and of course referring in the main then to that winter war way back in 1939, and the analysts are saying there are some similarities in what the brave Finnish people were able to achieve back then against the mighty USSR, similar perhaps in parts to what's happening in Ukraine.
Well, I can see that, of course, war in Europe is triggering in many Finnish families a lot of memories, and not only memories of warfare, but also memories of being evacuated from their cities and being IDPs in your own country and so forth. So there's a huge solidarity wave now in Finland, and when I'm driving to the office, I can see Ukraine flag here and there, and a lot of clear solidarity towards Ukraine. People are collecting clothes and medicines and driving by cars, trying to pick refugees to Finland, and this is something that we haven't seen for a while.
And Foreign Minister, let's talk diplomacy here. And what position is Finland in, not being a NATO member, but with this proximity and this history with Russia? What position is your country in to help broker a deal, given that a deal has to ultimately be the way to stop this conflict?
Well, of course, first of all, it's important to say that we follow all the European Union sanctions, and many Finnish companies have stopped their activities in Russia and so forth due to the sanctions. This is, of course, influencing also to the economic field. But at the same time, as you know, starting from President of our Republic, we have been keeping for years contacts. We have been talking to Russians, and even in this conflict moment, of course, trying to convince Russia to stop this stupid warfare, and at the same time supporting Ukraine also so that it could be as strong as possible in the talks. And I can see that the talks are ongoing, but of course it will need time, and certainly it will need support to Ukraine to stand strong in these talks.
You mentioned your president there, President Niinisto. Now, he's known to have a close, or had a close relationship with President Putin. Has he been in contact with Vladimir Putin recently?
Well, he has had one long telephone call with Putin, but also talking to President Macron and President Biden and Prime Minister Johnson and so forth, of course, trying to find a solution to this crisis. We have also been talking, as a foreign minister, to the Turks who have been involved in these talks and so forth. And of course, we have a very permanent contact with humanitarian organizations working on the ground, like the International Red Cross, which is doing excellent work in the middle of this misery.
And what shape? I mean, have you got an idea in your head of what shape a deal could look like? Will the Ukrainians have to swallow the fact that Russia is going to keep Crimea and keep its hands on parts of Donbass, and indeed will not be able to join NATO?
Well, I think these elements, as you mentioned, of course, are something that are requested by Russia: Donbass issue, Crimea, Ukraine being in the future a neutral country, and so forth. Maybe issues of the linguistical minority, Russian-speaking people in Ukraine, and so forth. But of course, the result of these talks depends very much if Ukraine can maintain their security and can fight back, and that's very important at the moment. And there should be also international guarantors of this kind of peace deal. We shouldn't leave Ukraine alone in these talks.
Foreign Minister, thank you very much indeed for sparing the time to talk to us on Sky News tonight. Very much appreciated.
Thank you.
The Foreign Minister of Finland there. And you're watching Sky News tonight. Coming up, is Russia preparing a large-scale assault to try to break the stalemate in Ukraine?
The risk if Afghan girls will not be educated, the future of country will be more darker than today. The risk of eliminating 50% of Afghan population from their basic rights, may not have a good consequence. And not talking about Afghanistan from the international community side and not holding Taliban accountable, that would be a big mistake, which is, it's going to be happen. Of course, the women and girls in Afghanistan is not the first time we are seeing the brutal behavior of Taliban. This is the second time. But we will find a way. Still, homeschooling is going on, online school is going on. But sooner or later, I'm sure the people of Afghanistan will stand against such a brutality. But this is important. Which kind of message we have to deliver to those girls, to those teenagers, to the women of Afghanistan, to the half of population in the world, in the globe. It's not just only they are suffering, we are suffering. Our heart is crying. Just the basic rights, education, access to education and going to school. It's not something asking star from the sky. This is just the simple basic rights which is Taliban have to obey. We need to pressurize them. We need to ask them. We need to hold them accountable. From August 15 till now, every educated Afghan liked to leave the country because of the Taliban brutality, because the lack of access to the job, because of the violence, because of the misbehavior from the Taliban, because of putting boundaries every single day. Unfortunately, even women cannot travel without male members of their family. Even men cannot travel out of the country without Taliban permission. Women cannot even go simple outside of their house and walk on the street without male guardians. That's very sad. In 21st century, we have been witnessing such things. If you see the borders of Afghanistan right now, it's full of impact from the people. They like to go out of the Taliban control areas, out of the country. It's not like they wish to go. They have no choice.
I'm Inzamam Rashid and I'm Sky's North of England correspondent, telling stories from this culturally rich region I call home.
Well, now, NATO's Secretary-General has announced further support for Ukraine, including equipment to protect against potential nuclear and chemical attacks. But it falls short of the no-fly zone and aircraft requested by Ukraine. And there are signs that the Ukrainian military is beginning some kind of counter-offensive. President Zelensky remains in office, and Russia has failed in its initial objective. But are the Russian military really beginning to fail in Ukraine? Here's our defence and security analyst, Michael Clark.
Vladimir Putin was going for broke in trying to conquer a country as big as Ukraine. But a whole month has passed in a campaign that was only planned to last a few days. This map shows Russian gains over the past month. You can see some of the advances, but nowhere near what was expected. Most of the country remains under Ukrainian control. So where has Russia gone wrong? My assessment at the beginning of the war was that if Putin doesn't win quickly, he doesn't win. I think that still holds true. The Russians made the fatal mistake. They underestimated their opponent, believing they'd be welcomed as liberators. The Russians deployed some of their elite forces first. They failed to hold their objectives in the face of Ukrainian counterattacks. The Ukrainians have adopted more flexible formations than classic battalion and brigade structures.
The fact that the Ukrainians have managed to kill so many generals is remarkable, and it's not just due to phenomenal work by the Ukrainians. It's due, it seems, to the fact that the Russians have communications problems, so the generals have to go closer to the action in order to see what's going on. I don't know any other war where so many generals have been killed.
In real warfare, logistics are fundamental. Poor logistics are Russia's Achilles heel, and a lot of their equipment is poorly maintained. They were told they were on exercises. They were not supplied for a long campaign, and their difficulty in resupply has left them vulnerable to counterattacks. This stalled convoy of Russian vehicles is a perfect example. In Iraq in 2003, the US dominated the airspace from the start. We expected to see the same here. But Ukrainian jets and drones are still flying. Their command and control remains intact. Russian forces are vulnerable to air attack. So why isn't the Russian Air Force doing better?
Russian fast jet pilots get somewhere in the region of about 80 to 100 flying hours per year. That compares pretty badly to Western counterparts. An Air Force like the US Air Force would often be getting between about 200 to 250 live flying hours a year in a fighter squadron.
If Putin thought the West would remain a bystander, he was very wrong. Sanctions and the withdrawal of so many companies from Russia is punishing their economy severely. And the Ukrainians are putting to excellent use the weaponry supplied to them by the West. These NLAW anti-tank missiles donated by the Brits are just one example. It's become clear that the Ukrainians have good intelligence gathering. They're weaponizing the disillusionment of many of their Slavic brothers in the Russian military. But it would be unwise to underestimate Russia in this conflict. Military organizations can learn to adapt and overcome their failings. And if Putin decides to take the war forward as a battle of attrition, then his military will do that. It means scenes like these in Mariupol or these in Kiev may be repeated.
Whoever tries to hinder us, and even more so to create threats to our country, to our people, should know that Russia's response will be immediate, and it will lead you to such consequences that you have never encountered in your history.
Putin will keep trying to frighten NATO with statements like this, while his attrition strategy is given time to work. The longer the battle goes on, the more sanctions will hurt Russia and casualties will mount. That's why, now that he hasn't won quickly, he loses. Russia's forces might still do well and win a new variation of Putin's war. But if so, he still loses the peace.
Michael Clark with the analysis there. So British intelligence is suggesting that President Putin could be preparing a large-scale assault in Ukraine as Russian forces face something of a stalemate after the stronger-than-expected resistance from the Ukrainians. Well, let's speak now to Mark Galeotti, an expert in modern Russia and Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Very good to talk to you, Mark Galeotti. And tell us what might be going on in the Russian hierarchy. We're hearing these strange reports of the disappearance, or certainly the non-sighting recently, of the Defence Minister and the Chief of the General Staff.
Yes, it's an interesting situation. And in part, it's precisely because in an authoritarian regime like this, the boss can never be wrong. So clearly, although it absolutely is down to Putin's own misunderstandings of Ukraine, that this whole disastrous initial strategy, which Michael Clark was telling you about, was adopted. But nonetheless, now he has to find scapegoats. And in some ways, different agencies are finding different responses. We've got the Federal Security Service more or less proffering up a scapegoat in one of their deputy directors. Whereas Shoigu, there is some talk that he might have
the Defence Minister.
Exactly, my apologies. But at the same time, there is a possibility that this is simply a diplomatic ailment just to keep him out of sight so that he doesn't have to get too involved in the war at the moment. And it is clear that this war is going badly, and that's a dangerous time in an authoritarianism.
Well, could he be getting paranoid or even more paranoid and fear plots against him and Stalin-like start removing the key individuals?
Yes, and I think you have to say that the chances of any such sort of palace coup at the moment seem very, very remote. The Russian system has all kinds of different checks and balances and different services blocking out and watching each other. But on the other hand, it's clearly been a priority of the covert information campaign that the Ukrainians are waging very effectively, and also the West as well, is to try and give all kinds of reasons for Putin to become more paranoid and precisely turn on his own agencies. So I think this is one of the ways in which we're seeing this is a war that is being fought out in very kinetic ways in Ukraine, but it's also being fought out not just in economic sanctions, but also in a whole variety of covert political campaigns to try and undermine the unity of the Russian state.
And does he seem to have a mole or moles within those security agencies you've been talking about? There seems to have been a series of letters leaked from deep within the FSB and other agencies, and I don't know, how sure you are about their provenance if they're verified to your satisfaction. But there does seem to be disquiet right at the heart of those agencies.
Yeah, absolutely. And those particular letters you're referring to, yes, I must admit, I have some qualms about whether they're accurate. But the reason why they're powerful is precisely because whether or not the letters are actually coming from some mole deep in the Federal Security Service, it nonetheless accurately reflects the real kind of disquiet. Look, remember, this is a system which has encouraged the rise of ruthless, pragmatic opportunists. And that's fine when the system is working and they are getting all kinds of great opportunities. But it absolutely means that these are people who, when they begin to feel that Putin is a danger rather than an opportunity, they will have no loyalty to him. As I say, we're not yet anywhere near a kind of tipping point, but it's understandable why Putin may well be feeling worried, because he knows just how carnivorous, even cannibalistic, these institutions can be.
Let's get to the kinetic part, as you put it, the war itself on the ground and in the air and at sea. And I suppose it's a tabloid way I'll put it. If Putin has miscalculated, the question is, does he back down or double down?
I think, in a way, and I'm going to live down to every expectation of the woolly-minded academic, both are true. I mean, on the one hand, we do have a peace process, which is proceeding, and there's a possibility that it'll lead somewhere, though not immediately. But the point is, though, that Putin will want to have the strongest hand possible in those negotiations. And this is why we're seeing stepped-up campaign, particularly to take cities like Mariupol, because in a way, each city he can take becomes a bargaining counter. So I think we're almost certainly going to see things get more violent and more ugly, even if, in fact, that actually is part of the process that brings us to a peace deal. But certainly for the next few weeks, it's going to be rough.
And Mark, analyse this for us, the threats, the continuing threats from Russia to go as far as using nuclear weapons if Russia faces an existential threat. Now, Russia's definition of what's an existential threat and NATO and the West's definition may be pretty different.
Absolutely. And look, I have to say that so far, at least, all the references to nuclear forces have really been about signaling. They have been about attempts at intimidation. And so in that respect, we shouldn't take it too seriously. And certainly, even within Russian doctrine, what we're seeing happening in Ukraine would not in any way be considered to be an existential threat to the motherland. But the problem is that the Putin we have seen in the last month and a half has not been the Putin of old, who, despite his bare-chested macho persona, was always actually very cautious, very risk-averse. Now we're seeing someone who, in some ways, is more of an old man in a hurry, who's clearly willing to take big gambles and who clearly feels viscerally that the battle for Ukraine is not just simply a battle for a country. It is for Russia's whole status as a great power and an independent sovereign operator on the world scene. So although I still think the odds of that kind of escalation are still very, very small, they're greater than under normal circumstances we could have expected them.
Mark Galeotti, great talking to you. Thank you so much for your analysis. Mark Galeotti here from the Royal United Services Institute. Now, we've just got time for a quick look at the weather for you. And the next few days are going to stay settled with plenty of warm sunshine. Air pollution levels, though, will be high in the east. So most places dry this evening, a bit cold, but some showers are possible, those mainly in southern and eastern Scotland. So little change overnight. The far north, though, will have some cloud and a bit of rain. Patchy ground frost again with some mist and fog developing as well. Tomorrow morning, then, almost unbroken sunshine once that mist and fog lifts. The Northern Isles, though, will be dull and damp, though most areas will be warm again. Now, the temperatures get this high of 20 degrees Celsius, around about 68 Fahrenheit, somewhere in England or Wales. The afternoon stays similar, but some fair weather cloud, whatever that is, will build, perhaps giving isolated showers. Ireland and Northern England look most at risk from that fair weather cloud. And you're watching Sky News tonight. Coming up at 8 o'clock, Western leaders discuss what more they can do to help the Ukrainians.